Most likely, the device on which you are watching this video was made in China, even if it is an American iPhone. After all, China produces 70% of all iPhones in the world. We are used to the Chinese economy impressing the world with its rapid growth. Over the past decades, China has become one of the main players in the global economy, ranking second in terms of GDP after the United States. Innovations, large investments, global influence. At the same time, millions of Chinese are forced to go down from their high-rise buildings without an elevator to use the public restroom, because their houses are unfinished. There is no water, no light, and sometimes no walls. Today, in 10 minutes, you will find out what is the price of China's rapid economic growth. From the poorest country in Asia to the second largest economy in the world, why yuan has now the worst exchange rate in history, and why are the large companies moving their production outside the country? Hello, this is the other side of China that is not depicted in travel guides. Let's get started. What? A demographic crisis in the country with the largest population in the world? That's a bit outdated. In 2023, India's population exceeded 1.428 billion people, which is 3 million more than China. You're probably thinking, so? Does the second most populous country in the world already mean a demographic crisis? For China, yes, and it didn't start today. Let's look back 45 years in our guide. When the Communist Republic carried out reforms and opened the door to investment, foreign companies were able to locate their production on favorable terms. Goods labeled Made in China flooded the world, and the country itself was called the workshop of the world. Today, their economy is worth $17.7 trillion. It is second only to the United States with $23 trillion. This success was made possible primarily by a huge pool of cheap labor. Therefore, demographic instability could have been a disaster. In 1981, China's population reached 1 billion. Communist leaders feared that population growth would get out of their control. Therefore, they introduced the one-child policy, which lasted until 2015. If a family had more than one child, they faced sanctions. Such children were called Heihaise, or black children. They were denied access to social institutions. For example, a child could not go to school. Due to cultural peculiarities, preference was given to male descendants. Many women gave birth to girls in secret, becoming Heihaise and hoping that a boy would be born next. Today, there are at least 13 million of these illegitimate births. They have no documents and no rights. It is not surprising that China has one of the highest rates of female suicide in the world. Many families simply refused to have children. China's population has aged significantly. Now, 1/5 of the country is retired. As a result, the demand for labor is growing, while the able-bodied human resource is becoming less. Today, 80% of Chinese factories are experiencing a shortage of workers. And according to forecasts for next year, the labor shortage will reach 30 million workers. The one-child policy has not worked. Against the backdrop of an aging nation, COVID has become a painful blow to China. The elderly, a significant percentage of the population, were at risk. The Chinese authorities, in their usual radical manner, have implemented a zero-tolerance for COVID policy, which would later result in the deaths of people from the fire and a wave of protests. Because it was not just a quarantine, the authorities really wanted to lock everyone in their homes and not even let them out into the yard. In the Western world, restrictions due to the virus are remembered for remote work, takeaway food, self-isolation during illness or after a trip, and masks. In China, it went so far as to weld the doors of the entrance to prevent people from violating the quarantine rules. Just imagine hundreds of millions of people staying in their homes for months. We are not exaggerating. The necessary minimum of food was delivered by drones. Tension in society was growing. Such measures caused irreparable damage to the economy. Many foreign businesses stopped working forever, and large industries were inefficient. People were running out of money and patience. For example, at the Foxconn iPhone factory, workers were not allowed to leave the premises and dormitories to prevent the spread of the virus. The tragedy culminated in the city of Urumqi, the capital of the Chinese region of Xinjiang, when an apartment building caught fire. The fire killed 10 people and injured 9 others. Subsequently, videos began to circulate throughout Xinjiang showing that it was quarantine restrictions that prevented firefighters from arriving at the scene of the disaster on time. This caused popular anger. People began to protest across China. In Shanghai, demonstrators even called on Xi Jinping to resign. The country's leadership responded with massive police involvement, and the state-controlled media ignored the protests. As a result, amidst the discontent, China abruptly changed its policy, lifting almost all domestic COVID restrictions. Whether such methods were effective is still a matter of debate. Are you still with us? Then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. There's a lot of interesting stuff coming up. Meanwhile, we go to the next page of our guide. After COVID, another crisis took over. Do you remember at the beginning we talked about the Chinese living in unfinished buildings? Well, in 2023, the news spread around the world that one of the largest Chinese developers, Evergrande, had filed for bankruptcy. The country faced one of the worst real estate collapses in history, and it accounts for a quarter of the country's economy. However, this story began earlier, about 30 years ago. Back then, the demand for housing was growing significantly. China introduced a model for developers, according to which they could sell apartments before they were built or even before the project started. One of these companies is Evergrande. They borrowed money from lenders and received prepayments from customers. Then they built the real estate, sold it, and used the proceeds to cover their debts. The business turned out to be very successful, but this activity was accompanied by an increase in debts. Their obligation to Chinese banks reached more than $300 billion. The real estate market was turning into a bubble. Developers' debts were growing, and the rate of apartment purchases was falling. In addition, the cost of real estate was increasing. Then last year, the government restricted borrowing for developers. They had to sell assets to pay off their current debts, and in the end, the company filed for bankruptcy. But this is just one case. In total, 53 developers went bankrupt, construction projects froze, and people began to withdraw their money en masse, which they paid for unfinished apartments. That's why you can see a huge number of ghost towns in China now. Customers who paid the last money for the construction are forced to live in these buildings. And no matter what measures the government takes now to help developers avoid default, it will be extremely difficult to convince people to invest in construction. In the end, let's talk about the party's policy, which actually led to the problems we showed in this video. Xi Jinping became the first leader in the country's history to be elected to a third term. At the beginning of his rule, he first voiced the term Chinese dream. It has nothing to do with the dream of an ordinary citizen of a decent future. Xi Jinping put into it the meaning of the Chinese dream of the great revival of the Chinese nation. Within the framework of communist ideology, this meant that a course was taken to increase control, censorship, and propaganda. More and more private companies were nationalized, and alternative and liberal groups were subjected to sanctions. There is a good example of Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba Group. He allowed himself to criticize the financial system in China. What do you think happened to him? Since he violated the main principle, you don't criticize the government, it lets you work, he was dealt with in a demonstrative manner. The company was subjected to harsh regulatory rules. Alibaba was fined a record $28 billion. Ma's fortune fell by half, and he was forced to go abroad. This is not a good signal for foreign companies and investors. That's why they are starting to withdraw their money from China en masse. Just imagine, the Chinese tech giant Tencent has lost $7 billion in investments in just 6 months. What will happen to China? China is facing a choice. The first way is to move further in a radical communist direction, and then the crisis in the financial and construction markets will grow. The population will decline. According to forecasts for 2050, it could decrease by 110 million, and this is a burden on an already overworked labor force. The second way, to open yourself up to the world. Open yourself up to the legal system. Involve people in the capitalist system. And, of course, not to violate people's rights. Which way do you think China will choose? Write in the comments. And stay tuned for the next episode, where we will talk about the other side of Canada. Have a great evening.